Welcome, Stephen Anthony Smith here. He's historian and senior research fellow at the All Souls College in Oxford, and he just gave a talk about communism in historical research since 1990. So let me start right now with a first question. Which are the major influences, the events of 1989, 1990, 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Which influences did those events have on historical research on communism?
Well, it increased the amount of knowledge extremely because we got hold of lots of new sources. These stimulated new lines of historical research. I think it's to some extent put the communism period into history proper, so that historians can now look at communism and see that it had a beginning, a middle and an end, and that inevitably changes historical perspective. In the years of the Cold War, when I first began as a graduate student, communism was still a very politicized subject. I think today's discussion shows that perhaps particularly in Germany there is still a politics that inspires discussion. I think that's less true in Britain, but even so, I can't see that communism will cease to be an object of political debate for a long time.
Have there been any significant paradigm shifts in historical research on communism since 1990?
Yes, I mean there's been a big increase in interest in the everyday life of citizens in communist countries, which has been made possible because we now have types of sources that tell us much more about what communism meant in terms of the workplace, but particularly in terms of family life, in terms of the extent to which people identified or didn't identify with regimes. There's been an interesting debate on what's usually called subjectivities, the extent to which people's identities were shaped by both the knowledge, absence of knowledge, by propaganda, by daily norms of communist life. And I think this is probably declining now in interest, but it was a very, very stimulating time to think about how one could think about the capacity of individuals to identify with, but also resist, accommodate, negotiate the different pressures that bore on them in everyday life.
Our conference asks for blind spots in historical research and public education, things like that. Do you see any significant blind spots in historical research on communism?
There's been a big move towards global history of communism, and as one looks at the communist movement across the world, and yesterday, very interesting lecture, there was a map that was shown of the peak of communism in 1970s, which showed just how extensive identification with communism was. But what struck me was that there are very large parts of the globe about which we still know very, very little. So, for example, we know very little about Southeast Asia, apart from Vietnam. We know very little about African socialism. So there are still those kinds of questions. I suppose in relation to the kind of work I do myself, and I'm more of a social historian, I still think there are areas relating to the great mass of the population, the peasantry, where we know very little. We know about things like collectivization, land reform, but we know very little about how ordinary people reacted to, made sense of what was an immensely traumatic experience in some respects. Not entirely traumatic, that's the wrong word, but it was a movement whereby the state unleashed very, very massive social and political change upon a population that was very traditional and that interpreted change in its own way through the medium of traditional religion, popular culture, folklore, and so on.
The conference also asks on public opinion, public images of communism. You as a researcher, which influence does scientific research on communism have on public images of communism? Which influence can it have? Which influence should it have?
That's a very good question. I've just written a book on the Russian Revolution, and I'm currently promoting it. So I'm talking to people who come to book fairs, for example, or people who come to a conference like this who are not academics. And I still think that the media of film or news in general have much more influence than academic research. And indeed in Britain I would say that there's been both a huge appetite, public appetite for historical programs, but actually the quality of those, as the number has increased, the quality has really rather declined. And so, for example, the Russian Revolution is in many quarters being presented in terms of individuals. So it's Nicholas II or it's Lenin. There's very little attempt to try and build in the kind of work that I and my colleagues here in Germany and elsewhere have been doing, which looks at economic history, at social history, and so on. And that's obviously is much harder to convey to a mass audience, not least because the images are so much fewer. But nevertheless, I think in some ways the academic historian has an uphill struggle.
So let's hope they assume a bit more the responsibility as sort of public intellectuals, I'd assume. Thank you very much for the interview and have a nice conference.
Thanks very much.